Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, a podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we are going to be discussing TJ's story with our special guest, TJ. So thank you for joining us today, TJ.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
So we are super excited to have you here, TJ. And before we jump into your story, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, so I'm 27. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I have a couple of pets, a small business, and I am working on shifting into a peer-to-peer advocacy role, just genuinely juggling a lot in life right now and kind of enjoying it.
Awesome. It is nice to have things that do keep you busy, especially when it's really easy to let your mind race to places when you're not. So.
Oh, absolutely. Busyness for me, and I discussed this with my therapist, but there's a happy balance of keeping busy and being too busy.
Yes. It's always fun trying to figure out how to toe that line and like where that line actually ends up being too.
Exactly. Yeah.
So like we said in that very short intro, we are going to be here to discuss your story today, and we want to make sure that we give you as much space as possible to do so. So TJ, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I thought I could kind of start from the beginning and, what a better place to start. So I was born in 96 and I had a pretty good upbringing, being born around Medford for the first 7 years of my life. Nothing incredibly notable. I've always had what you would call a single mother. So it was my mom and my grandfather and I until we moved to the coast. And so that was a pretty normal 7 years. And pretty quickly within moving to the coast, my mom met who would end up being her husband. And I'll stop there for a sec and just kind of look at the next mark.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the year 2002, my mom met a man and he would end up becoming my stepdad. And those years were somewhat tumultuous and abusive, but I did not have the wherewithal to really understand what was happening. And so the first major traumatic event really for me happened in 2005 when I was in a car accident that resulted in the break of my femur and a few other injuries, but mostly the femur is what impacted me and still does. So that was my first major traumatic event, and life didn't really turn around after that. I was into my teen years pretty soon introduced to sex abuse, further emotional abuse, drug abuse. Um, and having been through anger management now, I know I was used a lot in collateral damage. I have a lot of understanding now as an adult, but at the time, everything felt normal, if that makes sense. And so, having been a child with a disability, a lot of the attention that was put onto me, um, as far as the adults and other people around me, were my disability, right? Because it's obvious, it's on the surface. You can see a kid in a wheelchair, you can see a kid in crutches, you can't see those emotional scars. And so the emotional abuse and eventually what would manifest as physical and sexual abuse and some others as well, it was never reported to CPS. It was never noticed by other adults because I believe because of my immediate physical needs up until my early teenage years, everything else was kind of neglected. And then I accelerated so much in school to cope with both my disability and the abuse I faced at home that by the time I was 16, I was a freshman in college. So those years in my life where somebody could have intervened when I was obviously well, when I was able to walk again, when I was able to basically like quote be a normal teenage girl for a couple of years, that abuse went unnoticed. And by that time, after I had fully healed from my 4 surgeries, my mom had been divorced from my stepdad. Both of them had been abusive to me, but with the absence of my stepdad's abuse, my mom's abuse became much more prevalent. And so while my dad had sexually abused me, mostly verbally, it was my mom who set me up to be sexually abused and exploited by the amount of control she exercised over me. And she did also play a role or facilitate the trafficking I experienced in my later teenage years. So all this is every step I took in my life closer to adulthood led me up to being trafficked. It is like the final traumatizing event that happened before I was a legal adult. So I like to tell people, I kind of joke, but it's one of those trauma jokes. If you know, you know. I'm like, I crawled out of a dumpster and I don't have parents because my dad is dead and my mom has a lot of issues. I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose her, and I don't feel comfortable naming her disabilities because she chooses not to deal with them, but she lets her mental health rule her life and uses it as an excuse to abuse people and isolate herself. Because I'm not the only person she's done this to. She's abused other people. I just happen to be an only child. And after she divorced, I was the only I was the only subject for her abuse. So I received all, if not most of it, because most people had cut her out by that point.
Well, thank you for sharing that part. And obviously, we have more to get into here since this is only the very beginning of this story. But the abuse going unrecognized isn't uncommon, especially like you said, when you have something that they're primarily focused on. That's their main thing. Like, this kid's in a wheelchair. This kid's having multiple surgeries on their leg. Like, this is their main focus. So even the teachers, it can be easy for them to overlook the other things that might be going on because they might even attribute that to the injury or the disabilities that you're experiencing at that time. So it's really unfortunate that even when you had those people in your life, like educators and stuff, who could have tried to notice, when they were so focused on the disability aspect that you had, everything else might have just gotten wrapped up into that.
Right, because so they know that you obviously experienced some sort of trauma, which had you with this disability in the wheelchair. Um, all of this stuff stemming from your car accident. And for most people, it's a lot easier just to look at what's on that, that outside piece. What's that baseline? Oh, they've been through trauma. Well, obviously they've been through trauma. You can see it in their physical presence. Um, and it becomes way too easy for people to just chalk everything up to that. If you're having behavior issues, oh well, wouldn't you have behavioral issues if you had gone through that car accident? And then also I wanted to point out when you said that you were obviously a very good student, right? You excelled. You were a freshman in college by the time you were 16. Well, people don't look too deep at the kids who aren't the squeaky wheel, for lack of a better term. You were doing well in school, so obviously you must have that support. You must have something going on at home that's good for you to keep you doing well in school. But like you said, that was your coping mechanism, right? That was what you were doing to try and keep yourself maybe a little bit distracted from the things that were happening. And so people just sometimes overlook that. And I think that's really important to point out to our listeners, is that it's not always the kid that has the behavioral issues. It's not always the kid who has some sort of, you know, physical neglect that's obvious. Um, this kind of stuff can happen to anyone, and we need to be looking at everyone.
Yeah, and to add to your point, one of my friends who attended college with me on the same variant, we were both minors, we were both 16 and 17. We both struggled with substance abuse issues in school, and we ended up going the other way as far as educational goes are concerned, but we were both smart enough to be enlisted in college early, and yet we both struggled with substances. So it goes so much deeper as well. Knowing the signs, as you mentioned earlier, Sean, is so important, and especially those mandatory reporters just taking the time to learn what these little signs could mean, because the harm of having a conversation with somebody who could be hurting, worst case scenario, you'll find out they're fine, maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe they need help.
Hmm.
And as people in positions of power, it is our responsibility to take that initiative.
Yeah, it's like I would much rather be in a place that I know that they're going to be overly cautious of something and ask those questions versus a place that is just ignoring everything completely. If they're that mandatory reporter, I would much rather prefer a teacher ever talk to a if I have when I have a kids talk to my kid and say, "Hey, are you okay? Like what's going on?" I would much rather have that than have the teacher who's just not recognizing anything or pointing it out.
Exactly. And I know I grew up in an earlier era of the 2000s, but the model of punish the child instead of asking questions did not work. It didn't work for me when I had outbursts in the classroom, and it certainly didn't work for my peers. I think we need to look deeper when kids are having big feelings, as we say now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's always, and yeah, maybe it is that temper tantrum, or maybe they're just having a rough day, but it never hurts to check. And one of the other things that you had mentioned in there, TJ, is that it was your mom who was the one who was setting you up for the exploitation. And when people experience trafficking, a vast majority of them are introduced into trafficking or put into that exploitative situation by the people that they know. It is far easier for somebody to traffic someone that they know than it is for them to traffic a stranger. Even looking at Polaris, the Polaris Project's data, and I don't like using data because you can always make it say whatever you want it to say, but from their reported cases that they received, this is their like their most recent study of like the past year. Around 90% of those people of the genuine trafficking cases that were reported, all of that 90% had been initiated by somebody that they knew.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely common myth that we think of trafficking and by extension kidnapping happens
Mm-hmm.
just in a vacuum. And the reality, as you laid out, is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can, but that's not the standard.
Yeah, especially when we're looking at trafficking, it's like you said, doesn't happen in a vacuum because the people who are the most at risk to trafficking are the people who have historically been the ones who have experienced the most marginalization or the most harm. So, if we're looking at trying to prevent or help trafficking victims, if we're trying to prevent it, we got to make sure that we're looking at the people in our communities who are the most at risk. So, like people who are experiencing disabilities, they're at a greater risk for it. Someone who is experiencing substance use or substance abuse problems, they're at a greater risk for it. So it's recognizing the people in our communities who are the most at risk and trying to help the conditions in those communities so that they aren't at risk anymore.
Absolutely. I could not have said that better myself. It's too true, and it's unfortunate that it's true. But I think by taking the time to have these nuanced conversations in spaces like this, hopefully we can create a better dialogue and dismantle some of the mis and disinformation that seems to be too prevalent.
Yeah. So what comes next then, TJ?
Yeah, so I think it's appropriate for me to lay out how the biggest trafficking incident of my life that has formed me the way I have formed over the last 10 years. So I had begun going to community college in an era when online or hybrid learning had become relevant. And so it was not uncommon for students to have their and their instructor's contact information. And so I had been communicating with who I thought was one of my cousins or family members, and I had accidentally texted a professor of mine. And that opened up a portal into something very bleak for me that ended up turning into a nightmarish 6 months. And so I can't remember the context of the conversations, but it was inappropriate, and the professor I texted should have put a stop to it. He was also aware that I was underage, that I was on a variant. And so when things started feeling weird, I talked to my mom, and at that point, instead of my mom putting a stop to things, she encouraged it. She basically said, let's see if we can get money out of this guy, because he was a tenured professor, not just in community college, but also through a state college. And I did not have the coping mechanisms or the tools to see through my mom's abuse and to see how her abuse was now putting me in a new abusive situation in the hands of a pedophile. And I should say, this professor was in his early 60s, so I'm not talking about a 35-year-old guy that maybe could have looked, younger. I'm talking about some real gross stuff. Um, and so my mom failed not only to stop, but she encouraged it. And so the long end of the story, and I'm going to elaborate, of course, but the long end of that is that this quote unquote so-called relationship lasted for 6 months. And this guy had also lived in Seattle, so he was transporting me across state lines. I was having intercourse with him as a rape victim, and he was giving me money. So I now understand what that is. That's pretty cut and dry. But at the time, it was very emotionally confusing. Trigger warning for some sexual content here, but I derived an amount of pleasure almost from this quote unquote relationship, which I now recognize as Stockholm syndrome. You know what I mean? Or at least a variation of that. I was so manipulated by my abuser and by my mom's so-called approval of my abuser that I genuinely thought this is something that was okay and that I wanted. And then, in short, when I exited the situation, I was a very unhealthy, I now refer to myself as a feral child. I was an undiagnosed CPSD having maniac of an 18-year-old that was just ready to commit crimes until I did and finally got into therapy. And that took 5 years of me being absolutely unhinged as the final result of this final trauma. This man who took advantage of me, this pedophile, he basically ruined the last bit of hope I had to leave the situation I was in with an amount of normalcy. He robbed it from me. He took it from me, and nobody seemed to stop him. And so that's the short end of the story. I'm happy to dive in any way we need. And I'm going to pause for a sec.
Okay. Yeah. You are more than welcome to share as little or as much of it as you want to. We're never going to tell you what you can and can't share. Also, we're not going to try to pry into anything that you might not want to share. So to kind of help guide this then for you, what is the biggest thing that you are hoping to get out of sharing your story?
The biggest thing I want to get out of sharing my story is I've noticed people tend not to care sometimes about what victims say when they say it. They don't tend to care how victims say stuff unless they're poised and they're healed and they're amicable and they're this and they're that. So I want to leverage the privilege I have and the amount of healing I have, perhaps, to make other people care. What happened to me, I've worked through.
Mhm.
I am not an anomaly. I'm I hate saying this. I'm not special because I'm not, the only person this happens to. It happens to so many femmes, women, non-binary, BIPOC, children, adults. I want to make people care. At the end of the day, that's why I've now involved myself with the city on one of their commission boards. It's why I'm writing a book. If I can leverage the privilege I have in this world to try and make people, especially people in positions that have power, care about what we say as victims, especially before we're healed, like the version of you see of me today. Just ask the people around you if they need help and care when they speak up.
So a little bit of what it sounds like is we're looking at that kind of myth of the perfect victim.
Yes,
You
yeah, yeah,
you said yourself, like, at 18 years old you were unhinged, right? You'd been through trauma more years than not in your life, and you've been going through, trauma after trauma after trauma, and that can make people a little unhinged. Um, so if we're only looking at the people who can, present themselves well, if we're only looking at the people who know the right ways to stand up for themselves, and only offering help to those people who go out and specifically seek it, because you're 18 years old now, right? You're technically an adult, so there's no system at this point that's technically like looking out for you, but yet you're you're still a person who's had to deal with all of this trauma and not given the appropriate tools to know how to deal with it as an adult. Um, so when we're looking at people who are abuse victims, yes, we 100% need to be looking at those children and stopping the any kind of further abuse from happening. But we need to also look at those adults who have suffered it in the past and who need the help now.
absolutely. We live in America, right? And so we have a child welfare system, so to speak, that misses so many things. And then the day you turn 18, you are magically responsible for yourself and have to pick yourself up from the bootstraps. We don't get an education in high school anymore teaching us how to balance a checkbook, yet we can get into debt the day we turn 18. And that ripples into the way we care for our children and the way these children turn into hurt, traumatized adults, because hurt people, the cycle continues. And as you said, if we're not offering resources to these children and adults who may be acting out, who may be abusive themselves because the cycle is actively repeating itself, if we don't stop and intervene and ask them very basic questions, then the cycle will continue. You can't break the cycle unless you put your hand out and you cut it off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So then, kind of jumping into the heart of really what you wanted to talk about today, TJ. When you started that healing from all of these years of trauma, what did that healing initially look like for you? And how did that kind of go?
Yeah, so the story's going to jump around a little bit, but it's going to make sense when I lay it out. So I was 23 years old and I had committed my first and only crime so far. So I had been dealing with some issues at my apartment, and there was kind of a retaliatory war between landlords and a tenants union. and I had taken some anger out by damaging one of my landlord's property. It was not right. I should not have done it, and I took accountability. But that process of getting arrested, booked, I didn't have to post a bail. I was a nonviolent offender, so I walked in and walked out. But that process for me, it was really jarring. And I had court mandated anger management. And there's a lot of issues with court mandated anger management. There was a lot of misogyny that I had to unpack in the material I learned, but the core tenets of anger management really did give me a new lease on life. And I know it sounds cheesy. I know it sounds hokey. It sounded hokey when I was learning it. It still sounds cheesy today, but I still reference the tools I learned in anger management when I'm helping my friends, when I'm helping my peers, when I'm talking to my boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever. Um, so really for me, anger management changed my life. And I have been in one-on-one therapy ever since. So for me, the criminal justice system is obviously full of issues and needs reform, but it took me getting put into that system to get myself out of the system. You know what I mean?
Well, it's also just interesting knowing that often when somebody is forced to go through something, so like the anger management where you were court mandated to be there, it is very difficult when anyone is court mandated to do something, or if you're even forcing someone to do something to begin with, like the amount of effort that they're going to want to put into it might not be all there. So the fact that you put the effort in to learn all of the cheesy things that you learned going through it, like that says something about you and your character as well, is that you were willing to learn those things and put them into use, because not everybody's going to do that.
Thank you. I think part of it is being able to see past the cheesiness of it all, because they were teaching a lot of backwards things that just frankly aren't relevant anymore. In digging past what is relevant and what is not as a victim who's forced to be there, it's kind of a lot of unfair emotional labor. But by going through that process, I learned that sometimes life really isn't fair in a bureaucratic sense either. I had been used to it in the way I was treated, but it was a way of learning how to manage bureaucracy or red tape, which is something I was never exposed to. And that in itself was almost just as healing as the good parts of the anger management I got. And I'm not slamming anger management, but this particular anger management course taught women and AFAB people material written by an elderly white man. And when I brought that up, the females who led the group, or the women who led the group, they basically defended it. And for me, it was extremely problematic that women were mouthpieces of a man telling me how to correct my behavior in the face of being abused myself. Because since reactive abuse is a real thing, a lot of the material they taught is you don't react. If somebody is abusing you, you stay calm, you don't get angry. To get angry in return is to abuse. And that's what I have a problem with, because it does not address the complexities
Yeah.
of the cycles of abuse. And that's what I want to address as well. Like, this was state mandated. There are problems in our system when we continue to tell victims of violence, you need to be calm in the face of violence. When somebody has their hand on you, you maintain your level of comedy. And that is not okay. We need to stop teaching women and victims of violence that they are responsible for managing themselves and staying poised when their lives are being threatened.
Well, even looking at that, it's when someone does admit, like, yeah, this happened to me, but no, I didn't fight back. Well, why didn't you fight back? There had to have been a reason that you had to have liked it or wanted this if you didn't fight back then. So even the things that are being taught there's contradictions there. It's completely contradictory to tell a victim, oh yeah, be calm, don't do anything, don't retaliate, but then also to say, well, why didn't you fight back when that happened to you?
Exactly. And that's why we need to better recognize and understand the differences between victims exhibiting behavior who are in actively abusive situations, perhaps victims who have been removed from violence who are now starting the cycle themselves. Like there's a difference between a victim who has been removed from domestic violence, who is now repeating the cycle, and a victim who is stuck in the cycle of violence. And their only way to get out is to maybe punch their way out or steal their way out. You know, there's a huge level of nuance and healing that at least the system in Oregon, the legal system, just it's a one size fits all, and that's not how domestic violence works. That's not how trafficking works. It's not black and white.
Well, right, because if you're looking at anybody else who's in this situation, right? If you're somebody is currently in this situation for the first time, um, and they fight their way out of that situation, people will applaud it, right? Oh, they fought so hard. Look at how strong they were. So we'll allow that for somebody who's never been in the system. But once somebody has been in the system, oh no, not you anymore. Now you have to, use your words and use your emotions. And we're going to, make sure that you're held to a different standard now simply because you have been in the system at some point. And I think that we do that for a lot of people, right? There's lots of states that have laws that say people who have had to commit crimes because of the violence that they have endured. Well, okay, we'll forgive you of that, but only if you're like the perfect person from now on. If you never commit another crime and you do all these good things that we think good citizens should do, then maybe we'll forgive you. But it's a different standard than we would hold to anyone else, and it's just not fair.
You're right. It's so unfair because of the privilege I have now experienced through the fruits of my own labor and taking control of my business when I was actually before I committed my crime. By being able to control my income, it allowed me to recover more. And I now have this home and this vehicle and these things, and I'm healed. And so when I tell people who I allow to know this information about me, I hear, oh, I never would have guessed. Oh, I wouldn't have known. But 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in the middle of my addiction, my anger addiction, my love addiction, my addiction to hurting, um, if I would have told somebody, they would have said, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. So just the way we treat people based on how they carry themselves or where they are in their healing journey, if they've even started. We need to offer victims who aren't composed, who may never become composed, who need a help becoming composed. We need to offer them the same support.
Yeah. We focus so much on wanting that perfect victim to be fully willing and cooperative with whatever investigation's happening, with whatever therapy that they're going through or whoever they're talking to, answering all the questions for them. We focus so much on wanting that person to be that perfect victim that we will very regularly just kind of ignore or say, they weren't perfect. Why would you have done something like use drugs then? Why would you have fought and committed these crimes or done these bad things after these bad things happened to you then? And we're ignoring how trauma impacts people's brains in a way that now makes them use those mechanisms for coping.
Exactly. And sorry to cut you
Oh
off,
no,
but
you're good.
even as people I know in my life who I care for have been stuck in these cycles and they blame themselves. I should have known. How come I didn't know this one was going to be like this? I've been in this kind of situation before. I've been hurt by men before. And we sometimes, uh, you know, as victims of violence, find ourselves blaming ourselves, asking what we could have done. And the bottom line is, a lot of the time you don't know until you know. And so to blame ourselves, to gaslight ourselves, and for other people to help in that process, like as a victim, sometimes our brains aren't great either. We are like, why did I do this? Why did I allow myself to be in this situation? And then when other people say, why didn't you leave? Why do you let him do this to you? It's reframing and putting the blame back on the victim when they are often stuck in the cycle of self-blame or self-loathing. In my case, my cycle was self-loathing, hatred, guilt, uh kindness, rinse, wash, repeat. And so again, that goes into everything being so nuanced. We, instead of pointing a finger at victims, well, when you point one finger, you have three pointing back at you. We should be taking that hand and helping somebody up and asking questions instead of using that energy to blame somebody. How much energy does it take to ask, how are you doing? Are you okay? Instead of saying, well, you should have done XYZ.
Right, because even if all day long you can say this is what you should have done, it's not what happened. So where do we go forward from there? People will say, well, this was a choice that you made and you should have known better at this time. You know, so what, we're just gonna like wash our hands of these people because they should have known better than to get themselves into a situation where they were going to then be abused. It's like I said, it's a total double standard that we have in this world for people who are the perfect victim stereotype and people who did what they had to do to survive in the moment that they were in.
Absolutely right. I think, carrying off what you said, the perfect victim type is perhaps why we have such an obsession with true crime in America, where white women are centered in that, right? I listen to a lot of other media that tries to center BIPOC voices as well, but we love gawking at like the so-called like perfect victim. She was a mom, she was a this, she was that, she didn't deserve what happened to her. But if somebody has made mistakes in their life, if they get arrested, they're suddenly, well, maybe they had what was coming to them, or you know what I mean? It takes a couple mistakes in your life to be less worthy of life itself, almost. The worthiness we have, the same way we talk about houselessness and food stamps. Where I'm at, it's called EBT. I'm not sure what it's called on your side. Um, but
Yeah, same.
there's such discourse where I live about the worthiness of people being allowed to have a meal. So if we're busy over here arguing over scraps, deciding who's allowed to eat, then how the heck are we supposed to move past that and talk about who's worthy of therapy, who's worthy of group, who's worthy of housing? um,
Yeah.
it We've got a long way to go, but I think we can do it if we keep having these conversations.
Mhm. Well, it's even when we're looking. So, like I mentioned earlier, the groups of people in our communities who are the most at risk for trafficking are those who have experienced some form of systemic oppression or historical violence or oppression against them. So, when you're trying to focus so much on that perfect victim, well, you have groups of people who have been oppressed, not even historically, but still to this day, where some of the things that they might have to do to survive aren't going to be the things that you would have decided for yourself to do, because you might have far better options available to you at that point. If your baseline options are two bad options, you're going to pick the option that sucks the least. And yeah, maybe that option sucked the least, but that option still might not have been the most quote unquote like good thing to do, but it's what they needed to do to survive. So when you put so much focus on, well, if this person was a good person before, they didn't deserve it, but if they did bad things, like, well, they kind of got themselves into that situation, we're actively harming victims because we're giving them or making them hear consistently like, well, you put yourself in this situation, and not recognizing the fact that the communities that we have are putting them in the situations to make them make the quote unquote bad calls.
Exactly, because first of all, you have that negative self-talk as well. I've met very few people who've been through DV who haven't experienced that negative self-talk. And then you get the negativity from your abuser. You get the negativity from law enforcement if you encounter them. Maybe you get lucky enough to have a compassionate officer, but most of them are going to treat you like a perpetrator rather than a victim. And then you have community, friends, family who may or may not be supportive. And so when you quite possibly face all that uphill, if you're given one of two options, one being drugs, screw it, the drugs might seem better. Everybody hates me anyway. And in my
Mm-hmm.
case, that was me for a little bit. I've experienced most feelings in this cycle. But when so many people think you are the dirt on the floor, pulling yourself up and being able to say, I am worth more, I am valuable, I deserve resources, I deserve therapy, is just that much harder. And we should be lifting people up, not putting them down.
Yeah, it's even that, even for those of you who have listened for a while, it's the conversations that we've had about people who have done some form of harm in the past. If that person is going to consistently be viewed as a villain, and now this is obviously, again, the disclaimer of not everyone who has done harm is fully deserving of this. Like, some people just do really, really bad things. But people who have done harm in the past, if we're just consistently going to view them as that criminal, view them as that bad person, like you're saying, TJ, it's really hard to fight against that. And you might eventually just give in to, well, if they're going to view me as a villain anyway, I might as well do it. Or if they're going to view me as this drug addict, why am I fighting against that? I feel better using the drugs anyway.
Absolutely. And I want to be perfectly clear. I repeated violent cycles, which means I went from being victim to being perpetrator. And the amount of time I spent as an abusive person wasn't long. And my abuse was primarily emotional, but I repeated those cycles. And when I began anger management, I went from no longer being a victim to being an aggressor. And so I say mostly emotional because the crime I committed was a property crime. And I've learned as a CPTSD response, I sometimes break things when I get upset. And so for me, everything makes sense now. Sometimes I just need to get a bowl of ice and throw it at the concrete outside, and that's a healthy solution for me. But if somebody saw the violence I was exhibiting before I got arrested, the mason jars I would break in public, the car I keyed, they would think I was an unhinged person who deeply needed mental health help. And while that was true, I was also at the end of that violence cycle that I was repeating. I now can take full accountability that I was going to get worse. I may have escalated to worse crimes. I may have escalated to worse alienation and abuse. And it's because I was able to get help that the ratio of time I spent being a victim compared to being a perpetrator was much smaller. I only had a couple year window where I was causing harm instead of being the recipient of harm. So we need to close that gap.
Yeah. Well, and that's also part of the reason why I like to have the conversations of, we need to create spaces in our communities for those who have done harm to be able to learn to not do those harms. We always talk about how domestic violence, choosing to use any form of violence against somebody else, is always a choice. They're actively making the choice. They're actively making the choice to be emotionally abusive in a relationship. But if we can understand or help that person understand why they are doing those things, some people don't want to be abusive. Or if they're not understanding even what they're doing isn't what a healthy relationship looks like, we're going to miss those people. So if we're creating spaces where people are allowed to learn, and having conversations like this, it starts to help shift that perspective a little in our communities to where we can start helping people not only who have experienced abuse, but who have chosen to be abusive, help them not be abusive in the future if they want to make that change.
Absolutely. I've been thinking about this concept a lot lately, piggybacking off what you said. I realized I was never given a space to unpack that kind of stuff, that material. And through working through this with my therapist, I realized I never experienced unconditional love. And so you can't express unconditional love to maybe everybody in the system, but to give a place or a safe space to people who are repeating the cycles where they can feel like they won't be judged or they won't be cast out. Like obviously there should be like certain hard limits, but I'm not saying that like everybody who shoots up, you know, deserves to be thrown out into the streets. They deserve love, they deserve compassion, they deserve a version of unconditional love that maybe they didn't get enough of or something, because so many of us, I feel like, who do repeat these cycles, like my partner that I live with, my long-term partner, he's the first person who ever showed me unconditional love. So I had to learn that as an adult. And in part, it helped me unlearn some of these things. But the bare minimum of giving adults a space to unpack and feel love in some sort of way that maybe they didn't get. I feel because we can give people all of the tools that they may never use. We can give them all the therapy they may not want. We can force them into group that they may check out of. But if we make people feel loved, and if we make like the hardest, most, you know, least emotional men feel like they can break down, or, you know, just anybody of any gender, you know, people need a safe space where they can feel like they can let it go, because there's some science behind crying and releasing that in actually physiologically feeling some sense of release. That's why my doctor literally prescribed me to swim 3 or 4 times a week. She's like, if you don't do this, you are going to go cuckoo bananas. Like there is some science behind the physicality of moving bodies and crying linked to happiness and feeling better. I don't know all of that. I just know what my doctor told me.
That's why they're doctors. We don't need to know all of
Yeah,
it.
I
That
know, I
if it
know.
works, I don't need to know why it's working. It's just working.
I just like to think, and maybe this is being fantastical in my own head, but like how many people who feel like they have to be the toughest person on the block would feel a little bit better if they could have a good cry. You know what I
Oh yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And that could help our community.
And this would be far off topic of our discussion today, but it's one of my favorite discussions to have is trying to create spaces for men to where we don't have to feel like we have to wear that mask all the time.
I'm a huge fan of that because unfortunately, statistically speaking, men are often more perpetrators of
Oh
violence. So
yeah.
I feel like this could be a wonderful way to break the cycle. Like
Yes.
I'm I'm polyamorous, so I tell my boyfriend, I'm like, you're allowed to have feelings, you're allowed to cry. He's like a commercial airline pilot, and he feels like he has to be so buttoned up all the time. And I tell him, I'm like, you're allowed. Boys are allowed to be spoiled too. You don't have to just like be tough face all the time. And so I think men need to hear that more. And I think people need to do a better job at recognizing the symptoms of women. Like I think it goes both ways.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, being very cognizant of your time today, TJ, before we wrap this up, is there anything else that you would like our audience to know?
If you want to keep up with my socials at all, I have a link tree. It's link.tree/ TJ Keefer, Keefer 96. I am intermittently putting writings out there. And like I said, I'm shifting to a peer to peer advocacy type model that doesn't pay terribly well yet, but I'm doing it because I have some amount of financial privilege, and this is genuinely what I want to do with my life. I would like to see a life where I can help people for a living. And so if people want to follow me while I make that journey and listen to my opinions about mental health on TikTok, they certainly can. Otherwise, I'm just trying to leverage the privilege I have in the world to make a difference in my community and maybe beyond. I'm just a normal person who wants to live a happy, normal life and help my community along the way.
Awesome. I will make sure I have links to your link tree in our show notes as well. And way to steal my thunder, knowing that the question that I was going to ask you next was, do you have any socials you want to push up to the audience? But thank you for joining us today, TJ. We've enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully our audience has as well. And hopefully this was enjoyable for you as well. As enjoyable as it can be sharing trauma.
I'm an extrovert. I'll share anything.
I'm an extrovert as well, so I feel you on that one. But thank you again for joining us today, TJ, and thank you all for listening. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at TouchySubsPod to keep up to date when we have new content going out as well as new episodes. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really does help the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.